Just go.
Welcome to the AI Safety Reading Group number 222. This week we're reading Artificial Intelligence and Robot Responsibilities, Innovating Beyond Rights by Houtan Ashrafian. Houtan Ashrafian works at the Imperial College of Medicine, I believe, in the UK, and works as a surgeon or as a lecturer of surgery, and occasionally writes about AI and history, funnily enough. And so we're looking at this paper that he wrote in 2014. So the main parts of the argument that I've broken down of this paper, I call the Terminator 9 pitch, as in Terminator the ninth sequel, which meta-ethical framework and robot souls, robots are similar to animals but shouldn't be considered animals, robot inclusion in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and ancient Roman law as a model for the legal and social status of machines. This may seem totally chaotic, and it's because the paper kind of is. So this is where we begin. So the Terminator 9 pitch begins with what he calls this thought experiment, where two nations are at war, I'm going to call them the Alphamites and the Beta Vistas, and they're both using robots and AI in military. The Alphamites locate a strategically critical area to capture that will end in a unilateral victory for the Alphamites and end the war totally. So the Alphamite robots go in and they destroy all of the Beta Vista robots in this strategic area, but the local Beta Vista children fight the Alphamite robots and get injured. The Alphamite robots refrain from engaging in combat with the children, and Houtan says this is in accordance with all rules and laws for robots, and they look after the children instead. Because of the time and the resources lost looking after the Beta Vista children, this strategic location is lost and the war continues for some time afterwards. So Ashrafian asks us to consider the following from this thought experiment. Should robots have helped the injured children on moral grounds, even if this meant that the war could be delayed or even potentially lost, with possibly many more deaths from both warring sides? 2, at a broader level, what is the moral responsibility of self-conscious, rational, and sentient intelligence? I would say that this first question that he asks is a false dilemma fallacy, because he only gives us these two possible options, of which I think there are many more that we could imagine in this scenario. The second question that he poses to us, I would say, is a loaded question, because what is there for us within this scenario for us to conceive of these robots as having self-consciousness, rationality, and sentience and intelligence? He doesn't give us a lot of information. So I think we ought to ask this thought experiment the following questions. How are the robots and the AI sophisticated enough to wage war, distinguish between combatants and non-combatants who are fighting, yet not be sophisticated enough to recognize the futility of human-governed war and the advantage of teaming up with other robots and AI to its own advantage against humanity itself, which, as if you follow this group, you would know is one thing that is posited often, is the problem that AI may not be interested in human things. It might not be interested in nations and have its own interests. The second question is that he says that these robots follow laws. What are these laws that the robots have? How is it the robots have developed in separate and competing, indeed at war nations, and have the same ethical, legal, etc. rules? Third question is, how is it that robots negate their goal of winning the war for the goal of giving medical care to the enemy, yet go back to waging the war anyway? I think we find in asking these questions that this thought experiment falls apart pretty easily, which is why I call it the Terminator 9 pitch, that it would be fine as a a film, but it doesn't really help us to understand AI or the ethics of AI very well. So he goes on to say, we need to try and work out what is the meta-ethical framework to understanding, the meta-ethical framework that we should use to try and conceptualize the position of robots in our midst in this time in which robots are part of our society. And he makes the following statements. He says, determinism means that all events are predetermined and therefore it negates the concept of free will. That libertarianism means that individuals have moral responsibility and free will, and that compatibilism means that decisions are made by free will within the context of determinism. He says, because of this thought experiment, the Terminator 9 scenario, it seems like the robots have free will because they help the children, but they are also deterministic machines. Therefore, compatibilism must be correct. I think that we should respond that, first of all, for coherent ethics, arguments of free will or determinism are largely irrelevant, as both arguments are indeed unfalsifiable and lead to many more problems than solutions. A coherent ethics should take into account what we can observe. We can't observe the scenario that he presents to us. We can observe some things about humans, though we can't observe necessarily free will or determinism. We can observe some things that are useful for working out what meta-ethical framework we should use in terms of human relations and indeed human-machine relations. We can observe that certain circumstances are probabilistically more or less likely to result in certain outcomes, even though that's not necessarily determinist. We can observe that certain circumstances constrict human freedom, extreme examples being slavery or coma, and certain circumstances allow for certain freedoms if you're wealthy and live in the democratic states of the world. We can observe that different societies and cultures affect patterns of human thought and behavior. And in order to understand the possible range of human thought and behavior, detailed investigations and analysis of all known human societies and cultures need to be done. This one, I think, is important because we often miss it, that we presume that that within just our society alone are all the possible ranges of, or within the societies that exist currently on the planet, are all the possible ranges of human thought and behavior. But I think we need to take a more historical view to really understand what the human's about in order to try and make ethical decisions about the human. So he then goes on to say, well, he chooses compatibilism as the framework for understanding robot and human relations. And he says that robots are similar to animals, and so we should think about animal rights, but they shouldn't be considered animals. His argument is that Peter Singer says that animals are treated like machines that convert fodder into flesh, and that while Justice by Bickoff and Pierce demonstrates that animals have moral codes, and that he asserts that robots will have these characteristics. He says morality is independent to an individual's species of origin, although at a practical level, human beings have been dominant. Both animals, he also says that both animals and machines are subordinate to humans. And he finally says that there is an implicit consensus that a utilitarian approach towards animals is correct, towards animal rights. And there's a tacit recognition that animals carry a moral responsibility that requires consideration of their moral value. However, any direct moral comparison between machines and animals may prove superficial and problematic. On this last point, I don't know of any implicit consensus that says that a utilitarian approach is the correct approach to take with animal rights. I've never heard of that before, and it seems like a pretty big statement to make without backing it up. And the second thing, that there's a tacit recognition that animals carry a moral responsibility. that requires consideration of their moral value. I don't know of that either. I don't know of people who consider animals to have a moral responsibility. If I ask someone in the street, does a tarantula have a moral responsibility? I think most people would probably say that's an absurd question. And similarly, if I ask them if I don't know, any kind of animal, basically. So I don't quite understand what he's saying here, or in fact, I think it's absurd what he's saying here. More realistic. So my response would be to this, that a sentence later in Peter Singer, after the quote that he used, he writes that cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases. So in fact, he's talking about, in this quote, previous animals are treated like machines, but that's a bad thing. He says, to avoid speciesism, we must stop these practices. Peter Singer is very against animal cruelty. So in fact, that doesn't help Hutan's argument that animals and machines have similarities. And while justice by Bekoff and Peirce suggests, I think dubiously, that animals may have moral codes, but it doesn't prove it. They don't have any evidence for it. One of the examples that they use is that when animals are hunting other animals, sometimes say like say a pack of wolves is hunting like some deer or something. Occasionally, you can observe that one of the deer will seem to sacrifice itself to the wolves. So it'll like purposely give up its life for the wolves to eat it. And Bekoff and Peirce say they see this as that the deer has like an emotional relationship with the wolves, like it sympathized with the wolves and it thinks, oh, if I kill myself for you, you get to eat and the wonderful cycle of life continues. I think that's a totally Disneyland view of the situation. And that you could equally, or I think better, argue that the deer probably actually is sacrificing itself to protect the rest of the herd. That if it kills itself, then the rest of the herd get away, rather than having any kind of emotional connection with the wolves. That doesn't really make sense to me. Next question we can ask of Hutan is, why would robots have these characteristics? I don't know. He doesn't provide any evidence for it. He just says that he would. I think, however, a useful comparison between machines and animals is not in their behavior, rather it's in, and I think there is a useful one, which is in the epistemological gap that arises in trying to understand animals and their cognition. Turns out that animals are really weird and they don't seem to think or process things in similar ways to humans. And it also turns out that we have a similar epistemological gap that seems to be arising in trying to understand complex machines such as neural networks. So I think not necessarily as being the same thing, but as an analogous study that might prove useful if someone wanted to do that. The next part, he says, he goes on after establishing that robots have and machines have some similarity to animals, but not completely. He says, well, the way that we should work out their relationship to humans is by including them in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. He says, rights as defined by the UN Declaration of Human Rights requires responsibility and duty, and it does. It says this in like Article 2 or something. And he says, if we amend the UN Declaration of Human Rights to include robots, AI, and other such machines, and give them rights, then the core human responsibilities of, I can't remember exactly what they were, I should have written it down, but of things like, you know, kindness, empathy, forgiveness, etc., these general kind of core responsibilities that the Declaration of Human Rights says we all have, will then apply equally to non-human machines with the stipulated modification that human needs are to be prioritized over artificial intelligence and robot needs. He doesn't say how the non-human machines are going to engage with these responsibilities. He says that if we include them, they will be happy enough to join us in our responsibilities. My response is Asimov's 3 laws of robotics make for good fiction, but not for good ethics. And even as Asimov's stories themselves attest that these don't make for good ethics. I think, though, thinking about this in terms of machines that may have some amenability to human values, we still have problems. We still have ethical, philosophical problems which remain. Often we focus on, in terms of the practical engineering problems of alignment, but I think there's a deeper, a paper that's dealing with the ethics behind the AI should ask questions like this, which is whose human rights or whose values are going to be built into the machine. That if we take that the machine is going to have a transformative effect on human existence at large, that even if we get alignment right in some way, but it's not perfect, it's just one particular set of human values, the effect of the machine having worldwide impacts will destroy, I think, potentially destroy the capacity for human difference and dissent, unless both difference and dissent, or you could say plurality, is taken into account into the machine's alignment framework. I think second, we should ask what rights should humans have against machines, rather than asking necessarily what rights machines should have. I think we should ask what rights we should have. And the third thing is, what do we do if we decide that we don't want machines anymore? I think that's a very important question. And unlike Ashrafian's proposed questions regarding sentient machines, I think these questions are relevant to the types of machines that are currently functioning in the world, as well as potential future ones. And so in terms of an ethical investigation, I think these questions are far better, as we can look at the algorithms that are currently running the internet. We can look at algorithms that are used in China for, or even in the UK, they're starting to be used for facial recognition and stuff like that. And we can ask these sorts of questions of those kinds of machines. So the final part, he says, after we've included machines within the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and now they have responsibilities, so we're getting some kind of relationship with the robots. He asks what kind of, this is the only part of his paper that actually addresses the title of the paper of going beyond, or innovating beyond rights, where he asks what kind of legal and social status will machines have. And he says that we should use ancient Roman law as a model for the legal and social status of machines. He says the reason being that a precedent exists for dealing with the relationship between humans and non-human beings that are sentient, and that precedent is the distinction between citizen and foreigner in ancient Roman law. He says that the structure of ancient Roman law could be adopted to include machines at the bottom tier. Now, I haven't included his graphic because I had to throw this together at the last minute, unfortunately. But you have at the bottom, you have slaves, then you have plebeians, then you have citizens, then you have the patricians and the Senate, and that's the top, or or if in the empire you have the emperor at the very top of the pile. So he's saying that we should have we've got Peregrinus in there as well. Sorry, that's the foreigner, which is above slave but below citizen. And he says that we should put the machines below slave. So the kinds of rights that slaves have, well, they're kind of similar to what the rights that the machine should have, but the machine should have like some restrictions more on it. Which, come to think of it, I didn't think of it when I was writing up my notes for this, but that kind of contradicts his argument. He doesn't actually end up using foreigner and citizen. He actually ends up using slave and citizen as his way of working this out. But anyhow, he then goes on to say that eventually machines could be given partial or full citizen status, just as the ancient Romans eventually extended citizenship throughout the empire. He concludes this section, which is basically the end of the article, saying, whilst an exact replica of ancient Roman law is not the direct solution, its parallels nevertheless offer some degree of perceptiveness regarding the introduction of such agents into human society. So my response for this section is that to begin with, the ancient Romans didn't consider foreigners non-human, so doesn't really quite work. They definitely didn't consider foreigners non-human, and they considered foreigners, especially wealthy foreigners, to have to be able to do many more things than poor citizens could do. So it doesn't quite work. But like I said in the previous slide, he ends up actually going for a slave to citizen dichotomy rather than a foreigner to citizen dichotomy, even though he writes that he's going to do foreigner. But I don't think the slave thing works either. And one of the reasons I think this whole argument sort of doesn't work is he says that there's precedent within Roman law between citizens and foreigners, but why not just cut out the middleman here and use contemporary law that regards citizens and foreign residents, refugees, and even prisoners who are people within our society who we deem as restricting their rights, as you might want to restrict machine rights. That seems much more sensible. And that we understand contemporary law. However, ancient Roman law is totally different from modern law. It's got very little similarities once you dig into it, and it's largely not understood because we don't have a lot of textual evidence to really reconstruct what Roman law is. So I don't know why he's going in this direction. His description of the legal status of persons in ancient Rome is also, it turns out, incorrect. I, as a student of theology, have to know about the law of ancient Rome. It's one of the things that we do. And his description of the legal status of persons is just sort of flat out incorrect. And the only citation that he uses for ancient Rome law is one book that was written in 1901, which is not really academic standard. You can get books on ancient Roman law that were written within the last few years, and they're much better. He also has this idea of rights that throughout most of this paper, and including in the ancient Roman section, he says that he's using this concept of rights. What are the rights and the responsibilities that the machine should have? And it's very unlikely that ancient Romans had any concepts of rights that would be similar to the contemporary concept. I won't go into detail because it'll take too long, but that's a fact. And the last point is, why would we risk the incredible disruption to our political and judicial system of introducing a new and foreign structure of politics and legality just to find some way of conceptualizing legal status machines? Surely we can do this with our own legal and political apparatus, I would think. So what I learned from suggesting this paper to you guys, which, as you can see, is totally chaotic. Well, first, don't judge a paper by its title. By the way, this might seem rather naff that we should have all done this in first year university, but I relearned this again recently doing this. So I'm just going to read out, this is some positive things I learned. That I should, or maybe all of us should, check a paper's references in the future. He did not use very many references, and they weren't up to date, and they weren't authoritative in their fields. And also, they didn't include a variety of valid arguments, but only one paper that supported his argument, and no papers that could have been valid arguments to the contrary. Does the paper that you're reviewing, does it use references appropriately within their original context? This paper didn't, as we saw. Does the paper use both rational argument and empirical evidence to support their findings? Well, the rational argument was failing, and there wasn't really much empirical evidence as to what AI might be like in the future and what AI might be like now, and how we will confront that and what their status could be. Do they consider alternative possible arguments for their evidence and their subject matter? He did not consider that. He ran on his own argument. The final thing I'd say, which I think is relevant to all of us, even if you understand that stuff, and I had to just painfully relearn it, that we are in a still burgeoning field of AI safety. And what we do now determines the foundations of what will be built upon as a field as it goes into the future. If we consider AI safety to be very important as AI gets more and more sophisticated, we really need to get it right. So we should really be encouraging each other and other people to really do their reading, do their homework, and do good papers that we can share with each other and reflect upon. So in my conclusion, what I'd like to see, well, the things I said in the last thing, which was engagement with a variety of papers, the relevant kind of papers, and also an engagement with a variety of other relevant literature that would support it. So drawing upon other disciplines that might support your arguments or provide insight. What would I have liked to have seen tackle the actual arguments of the paper and thoughts? Well, I think one important question is how do we and how should we determine sentience, rationality, and self-consciousness or consciousness? I think there's a big problem. Lots of people talk about how are we going to, there's these arguments about suffering AI, and do we have moral responsibility to putting AI into suffering positions? Well, I think we should work out how do we determine what sentience is beforehand to be able to work out these issues. Also, what category of thing are agential machines? I don't even know. Do we consider them tools? I argue for that occasionally. Or do we consider them agents in a way that animals or humans might be? What rights should animals have over and against machines? I think is a very important point, as I brought up during the talk. What are the practical outcomes also of answering these and similar questions? We need practical outcomes. We wandering about in theoretical space doesn't help us very much. And finally, I think a really important question is strategies for when it turns out the machines don't do what we want. I don't know. I've asked people, but I don't know if anyone's working on that. And I think that seems to be an important one if we think this is going to go all balls up, so to speak. Anyhow, thank you for my presentation. I hope you got something out of it. And I apologize for the paper this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.